many standing. Alexander Gabuev, who's the director of the Carnegie Center in Berlin and a leading expert on Russia's domestic foreign policies. Also, in particular, probably the only person who can tell you something sensible about Sino-Russian relations today. And so it's a great privilege. So thank you again for coming. It's so wonderful to see you, Sasha. We see each other here on a regular basis. So I'm really happy.
You never need me to convince to come to SAIS Bologna. This is all the time my favorite part of the year.
So I'm thrilled. I'm thrilled to do that. And I think since we have a smaller panel today, just me and you, I thought what we would do is we would just engage in broader conversations about where things are, cover I think the latest on peace talks, try to understand the positions of different countries, maybe also plug China into this, and then open the floor to general discussion. So probably we should just spend more time on general discussion so that we can have a more inclusive dialogue. But let me just
do we do that on the record or off the record?
Yeah, we're
on the record. Okay.
In other words, it's being recorded, but it's not being broadcast, or is it being broadcast? It is being broadcast.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. No, I think that the public and the private version of me are different, but not that different. So I just try to bridge the gap as much.
We'll turn the microphones off if you need to say something really
not
drastic.
Not really.
Oh, okay, yeah. We can. Yes, fair enough. Fair enough. We can do that. All right, fair enough. Okay, well, in this case, let me perhaps ask you this. So for some time now, for weeks on end, we have been having something that appears to be some sort of a peace negotiation that is happening alternatively in different capitals. We had it in Moscow. We had it in Miami. We're having it in Berlin now. There are different players involved. There are obviously the Ukrainians, the Americans, the Russians seem to be also part of this, in one way or another, part of these negotiations. I guess the question I have for you, Sasha, is this for real?
Yeah, I guess it's for real. I think that we are in the second iteration of pretty serious negotiations, which have a real chance to end the war. I'm not super optimistic about the chances, but I think that they are right now in the ballpark of 30%, 40%.
And they depend on the Russians accepting this stuff.
No, they are contingent on many things. Russians are the most important variable, but they are not the only variable. And the basic truth is that for now, both sides have the will and resources to continue the fight. Neither side is facing conditions where they need to accept whatever the conditions are imposed on them by the other party. So it's a contest of will and resources. So it's both psychology and mathematics. And I think that for both sides, they have theories of victories that I think, unfortunately, that on the Russian side, it seems more plausible to me that their case is stronger, but also not that they have resources to impose their maximalist vision.
So let's talk about theories of victory, because I think that is super, super interesting. And I think that's where a lot of the confusion arises from when we actually get to the peace talks. We have well-known demands from Putin, which include Ukraine's permanent neutrality, the territorial concessions in Donbass, including Ukraine's withdrawal from certain parts that they still continue to hold. We also have demands about changing certain laws in Ukraine. We have this interesting bit about Zelensky's legitimacy or not. It's clear that he wants Putin, that is, wants Zelensky out. But I guess the question that befuddles me at a certain level is, does Putin want political control of Ukraine post-war, or is he satisfied with a truncated Ukraine that would actually maintain its let's say, independence, because when we say independence, and this word has been mentioned, independence, sovereignty, et cetera, what that fundamentally means, and certainly Putin must understand that this would be an anti-Russian Ukraine. There's no way that an independent Ukraine would be in some ways, pro-Russian. Would you agree with that?
Crystal ball is not part of my research instrument, unfortunately, so I cannot look into Putin's brain and I cannot tell you exactly what he thinks.
I have a Wi-Fi connection, I'm telling you.
I wish. I'm not sure that this server will really work in Russia because you know that Russians have now multiple problems with internet connection in the country. But I guess that everything what you mentioned is on the demand list, and I think that every part of that is important. So when people say, "Oh, it's a bazaar type of negotiations," like you are bargaining about a price of a rug in Istanbul somewhere, and you say it's 5,000 liras, and then the salesman says, no, it's 50,000, and then you agree somewhere closer to 20,000. That's not necessarily the case here. I think that the guy ultimately believes that he can have everything
100%.
right off what you mentioned, right? The territory, the neutrality of Ukraine, that counts also decimated armed forces with no intelligence, military, technical assistance from the West, plus all of the laws that put the Russian-speaking minority, plus the Orthodox Church under.
So when we say Putin's control of Ukraine, this is what we mean, right? So effectively, Ukraine, which is not in a position to defend itself. I mean, if he gets down to the number that he wants, which is 85,000 troops, if you go back to 2022, plus what you said about keeping all the Western weapons out of Ukraine, which is wow. How can Ukraine possibly defend itself in the future against any further Russian encroachment if those conditions are imposed? So effectively, that means that Ukraine. I mean, it doesn't necessarily immediately mean that it's under political thumb of the Kremlin, but it sort of almost implies that, no?
I would say that it's a trajectory for implosion. That's the first stage. And then after implosion, we'll see. Because if he is able to impose what he wants, that leaves Ukraine undefendable. That's the crux of the issue. Like security guarantees are really the crux of the issue. And that changing Ukrainian constitution again to permanent neutrality or NATO's issuance of written oath that it will not expand. I don't think will suffice, because if you jumped into Putin's shoes, he's been promised many things, also codified. Ballistic Missile Defense Treaty that Americans walked out of. Like a lot of things that have been promised, Minsk Agreement. Right? Promised and then never delivered, because once the conditions change, the West, in his mind, and like there is some truth to this narrative, tells Ukrainians, don't do that. That is a deal against your interests, and we will support you, in pushing back against it. That's the story of Minsk. So with that, I think dismantling the link that connects Ukrainian military to NATO and NATO support is a crucial part that he wants to enable. If that's the case, Russia can reinvent any time of its choosing, literally. If this, security assurances are not.
Would it though, given that, let's say, a part of this whole business is reestablishing of the economic relationship with the United States, removal of sanctions, would you want to then reinvade and jeopardize all of that? Or
again, that's contingent. We see how much will happen. But if do you believe that there is a big economic fortunes to be obtained through cooperation between Russia and the US?
Absolutely not. That's why when I saw that Wall Street Journal article, I said, these people are missing out.
On a good day, the US-Russia trade relationship was what? 30 billion US in 2011.
It's 240 billion now with China, right?
And 247 last year. It will be 10% less this year, but that's beyond the point. Exactly. Like that's a very small figure. Are there any bankable projects that smart guys at ExxonMobil, JP Morgan, and so on Jamie Dimon will open his wallet and put a 15 billion?
That's what I was wondering. When the Wall Street Journal article said that Exxon is trying to return to Russia, and I guess they have Sakhalin 1, right? That's their only thing there, right? I don't know what happened there.
No. Well,
it hasn't been expropriated,
it's
right?
now expropriated, but there is a legal opportunity to get
to
back
reclaim, yeah.
or to reclaim a compensation.
Oh, okay. So that's what they were talking about.
Right,
I
but
mean,
ExxonMobil has pretty like multiple sources of getting oil
yeah.
outside of Sakhalin.
I mean, if you are an American businessman thinking about going to Russia, you have to think twice. If you're a serious businessman, not like a crook or something, you know.
So like this price is elusive in a way,
Yeah.
right? Sanctions removal and so on is nice, but then
But they could be, yeah.
the revival of Russian economy and rebalancing it again to where you have a sizable market in Europe and you have source of tech and source of knowledge and infrastructure and people-to-people relationship as well. And you have the same in Asia with China is contingent on whether the Europeans will reestablish.
And this is a big question, right? You have an American administration that says, yeah, you know, let's build whatever, you know, bridge to Alaska. But you have Europeans who are not so keen, or are they? Because that's, in my mind, a really major question. Of course, when we talk about the Europeans, we're really talking about the Germans fundamentally here. So with the Germans, are there people, and you would know that you're sitting in Berlin, I'm sure you have this, you know, this kind of conversations. Is the German industry prepared to re-engage with Russians on the question of gas, for example? Is that something they're willing to do? Is that something, if they were willing to do that, is that something in which they could overcome resistance of, let's say, Merz and, you know, the German government?
Parts of German industry, yes, but also the war has produced new industries that are reliant
like
on LNG, on imported LNG. They built the terminals very rapidly, thanks to Robert Habeck, the former vice chancellor. And there will be abundance of cheap LNG in the next 2-3 years because of big production facilities coming online in Louisiana this year.
Yeah.
So the necessity to go back to cheap Russian gas is not as acute as it was 2 or 3 years back.
In other words, it's wishful thinking on the Kremlin's part, because they have been hoping for that, at least for a time. I don't know if they're still hoping to have that.
Again, I don't have a crystal ball, but they definitely would love to have this.
Yeah.
But then if you have this political opening with Trump and everything is normal, Russia is forgiven at least by the United States, and you have a deal that gives Russia a Ukraine that doesn't have a credible security assurances, that needs to conduct an election, that needs to abandon martial law and open the borders, what's the likely trajectory of the country in your view? If you're sitting in the Kremlin, you believe that no serious international investor will put its money if it knows that Trump is out of the picture 3 years down the road. For example, there is a messy election and a recount that makes, you know, the Florida recount of the thousands, Al Gore and George W. Bush, like pale in comparison of the political turmoil in the US.
Yeah.
So captain of Team NATO is increasingly inward looking. And then Russia makes a move claiming that Ukraine has violated terms of the agreement.
In other words, if you're a businessman in Europe or in the United States, you effectively would be you would not have any incentives to invest in Ukraine at the moment.
Into something long term.
I think that
if you are taking a conservative approach and Ukraine doesn't have security assurances of its own, which is strong Ukrainian armed forces, that's exactly the trajectory. And that's why Putin is pressing on this point. So no security means no reconstruction, means no economic viability. How many people has Ukraine lost in terms of population? Not people killed, but people who have migrated.
I would imagine at least 7 million.
That's I think that's exactly the number that the Europeans are operating, probably already more. So pre-war, on paper, the pre-war population of Ukraine is roughly 47 million. I think that the realistic figure would be 37.
Yeah.
So now we are down to below 30 million.
Remember that many of them went to Russia as well, a sizable amount.
That's right.
A sizable amount.
So wars, like the shooting stops, border is open. There are 7 million, mostly women and kids, who are already on trajectory to become European citizens.
They're not coming back.
I think that many of them are not.
Yeah.
Will their men come to them in Europe, or will they stay in Ukraine?
Well, that's the question. That depends on the European Union. In fact, one of the things that I wonder if the Europeans have a contingency or are planning for is in the worst case scenario that you've just described, i.e., implosion or meltdown or something like that. Would that not generate substantial refugee flow that would perhaps even rival what we saw in 2022?
That's what many Ukrainian colleagues of mine are telling us, and that's what some governments like Poland are looking into, not Germany that much. But then the question is what you will do with that wave of refugees with men. Like, will they go into unemployment, welfare scheme, criminal gangs, or will you set up a framework where people can work in the economy or contribute to European defense, right? As something which is French Legion or other models that will be able to make them employable for European militaries. But that's beyond the point. Core is that Ukraine will be increasingly set on path for depopulation, long-term economic implosion, and that's a chain reaction that just doesn't generate enough fun.
Isn't that so? I mean, I can see how this is a problem for Europe, but isn't that also a problem for Russia if it's trying to absorb a Ukraine that has been torn by war, that is basically is going to take decades to rebuild, it can never be rebuilt with resources that Russia clearly does not have? Doesn't that mean that Russia is going to be for Russia or Ukraine is something of a cancer that is just not, it's not going to work out for Russia either?
But it's not part of Russian territory. So if it's a wasteland, that is now kind of an example of what happens if you're trying to break out of Russia's orbit.
Yeah,
that's okay outcome,
from
right?
their perspective.
From their perspective, most likely, right? And then you look at Georgia, and also that's probably an example that the Russians have in mind. So a country that had a war with Russia, that lost 20% of its territory to the Russians, and yet, you see the autocrat in charge now.
Totally hedging his bets and basically counting on Russia effectively.
And I think that's sitting much more in Russia's pocket than in Europe's pocket.
And that's in many ways, this is a result of this war, because if you are in Georgia, if you are in Armenia, you are looking at the situation and you're thinking, okay, can we actually trust the Europeans to bail us out? As, for example, our predecessors, the likes of Saakashvili, had believed, or is it all the phantom? And I think some of them are concluding that it's not necessarily going to work out, and that a safer bet would be to kind of re-engage with Moscow.
So if that's your theory of victory as Vladimir Putin on Ukraine issue, and we are talking Ukraine issue only, which is very important, but there is another issue, which is European security architecture, which we should also spend time talking about. So if that's the case, why would you make a compromise and give Ukraine anything what resembles a credible security guarantees and ability to recreate a deterrent of its own?
So let's first of all, let's separate those two issues out, because there's one thing that has to do with Ukraine's own army and ability to defend itself, in particular by bringing Western weapons, and ability to deter Russian strikes by developing similar, or at least importing similar missiles and so on. So that's one thing. Security guarantees is another thing. And one thing that has puzzled me in Kiev's approach to this issue is this insistence on Western security guarantees, which are, even if they were given, would they be credible? In other words, if there's anything that the last 4 years have shown, is that the West lacks any real interest in fighting a war with Russia over Ukraine. We haven't seen this. And so the question is, how can viable, I mean, what kind of guarantees are we talking about? Are we talking about Article 5 style? When people say Article 5 style guarantees, they usually have not read Article 5. So that means consultations and then we'll see, right? That kind of guarantees, that's what we're talking about. Are we talking about the guarantees of the style that they had in the Istanbul Agreement, which Russia tried to veto, which actually includes closing Ukrainian airspace, providing weapons and potential boots on the ground? Actually, this is spelled out. There's no way, by the way, that Russia would agree to that, right? There's no way that you could actually have a peace deal where the Russians say, okay, we agree to security guarantees, which would bring American troops to Ukraine. But the question is, would anybody believe that America is willing to deploy troops to Ukraine to guarantee? I cannot see this being the case.
2 points on this. I think that initially Europe and the West, led by the United States, have been indeed very cautious, because all of the analysis that the intelligence agencies had would suggest, or majority of analysts, except for maybe INR, the intelligence part of the State Department, told them that Ukraine will be rolled over by the Russian invasion in 3 weeks and Putin will achieve his goals. And that is possible. I think that looking backward, we're looking at Russia's military misery as the most likely trajectory, which is absolutely not the case.
I agree. People don't get it, right? Because it came actually pretty close.
Yeah, we are not living in the most likely timeline, and what the military professionals, which I'm not, like everything what I say about military stuff, just disregard it in a way.
But you have a great expert now with Carnegie Berlin, Michael Koch.
Not with Carnegie Berlin, but with Carnegie Endowment.
Oh,
and Dara Masako.
So he always hangs out in Berlin, so that's why.
Because we are cool kids club. But so are our colleagues in DC. So anyway, the colleagues we are working on say that they were both convinced that this will not be a close call and Russia will really roll over Ukraine. And everything what went into their analysis, I think, disregarded the crucial factor of how far Ukrainians will be able to, resist, how nimble their defense machine really is.
Also, U.S. involvement from early stages.
U.S. involvement from the early stage, which was not disclosed.
It was not disclosed.
And then all of the wrong political perceptions that went into Russian design and plan of the operation, where Putin was convinced that just as the south of Ukraine has fallen very quickly because SBU, the internal intelligence agency and so on, was very corrupt there, right? And nobody gave orders to shoot, to blow up the bridges and so on. So he believed that this is the case across the country, and he was definitely wrong. And thanks God that we are living in a different timeline. But it was a close call and a coin toss, right? And what American colleagues are telling me, which is believable, they say, if in our case we would game an invasion and then the chances of success are below 90%, it will be the uniformed guys who will come to the president and say, Mr. President, maybe it's the problem for the State Department. Let's call it foggy bottom. Let's give diplomacy a chance, because we have to send our boys into this mission with like probability of success that makes us discomfortable.
90%.
90%,
wow.
Right? And that's probably, a symbolic number, whatever is the real number, but like on an expeditionary mission. The Russians never did this. And it's basically a coin toss, like it's 50-50. And then if the whole game plan was really about taking this airfield in Gostomel, bringing in Russian paratroopers, and then storming into Kiev, they would say we would build a model of Gostomel somewhere in Siberia, and we'll train our Spetsnaz and Navy.
The Americans would say that.
Yeah, the Americans would do that. And like for 6 months, like the killing of Bin Laden, we drilled our best guys for 6 months, having built exact replica of his house in Abbottabad in Pakistan, so that they can go there with their eyes closed and do the job. The Russians, because of secrecy, gave their troops a paper map of the place 40 hours before the mission and say, like, you are really tough Russian guys, go do it. Right? So just nobody could expect this level of clumsiness and hubris and so on. So again,
I don't know. And when I was in Kiev recently, I went to all the little, the battlefields just to see where the fighting was. It's crazy. It's crazy
how close they came.
I mean, first of all, they came extremely close, right? And there were the argument that I've heard from some of the Ukrainian military guys was, look, if our military actually believed the political leadership and thought that nothing would happen, and we would keep our troops in the locations that were supposed to be, etc., we'd be gone by now.
Yeah.
So that's what a lot of people don't understand. So Putin miscalculated, and all the Western analysts miscalculated. Actually, could have gone the other way.
So coming back to the question of fighting for Ukraine, I think this has set up into an entirely different timeline, where the Western governments have made much more over time, gradually, than they have initially expected. If somebody would tell me on February 24th, 2022, that Sasha, 18 months down the road, the Brits will shoot their missiles at the Navy base in Sevastopol and sink Russian ships, kill Russian sailors in a broad daylight, and they will have a fig leaf of Ukrainian involvement and so on, but the Russians would know. Everybody in business would know that this is done by the Brits. There is no other way around that. Storm Shadow and so on,
Well,
I would
yeah.
and say like there will be no World War III, and Russians will be just pulling the punches and being like doing the hybrid stuff, but nothing like really kinetic, big time. I would say get your head examined, right? And stop smoking the stuff that you were smoking. In reality, that's exactly what happened. So I understand that people are very frustrated about my former boss, Bill Burns, and my former colleague, Jay Sullivan, and everybody else who were just too timid, too calculating, and waiting for too long. But I think that they pushed the envelope.
They did
very far to where nobody has expected.
I mean, that they did, and that I will still say this: if you are Jake Sullivan, or whoever the hell you are now, I guess it's Marco Rubio who's now allegedly, you are looking at the situation and you're thinking, what are America's national interests here? Are America's national interests to have a nuclear war with Russia? And I think the answer is probably going to be that's not in America's national interest. So therefore, you will always put that as the primary consideration. And that totally explains this very slow kind of attitude. But you'd also have to agree that providing storm shadows, or whether it ATACMS or HIMARS, all of that technology to the Ukrainians, and even in being involved, and as we know, they are involved through intelligence, etc., in the launch of that stuff. It's not the same as in actually, a full-fledged commitment to, let's say, fighting in Ukraine, right? So that's
but that is very clear. I think like you're absolutely spot on. Like if I'm a national security advisor of US president, I have a hierarchy of priorities. First is to keep American troops safe. And like that depends on your risk taking. I think Jake's risk taking was very low for understandable and all the right reasons. Then it is to protect your allies, right? And that's the perennial Cold War question, whether you would trade Manhattan for West Berlin in a nuclear exchange. And that question was never empirically answered, thanks God.
Yeah.
Right?
The answer would be no, by the way.
Okay.
Pretty clear.
You are a Cold War historian, so I will totally trust your word on this, right?
But there's, of course, little chance that it might have, and that was the deterrent effect, right?
So that's your second priority, to keep your allies out of harm's way. And then third is to help democratic, Western, aspiring, good countries who've been invaded by their ugly imperialist neighbor. But it has a very clear priority. So if point 3 contradicts point 2 and point 1, you always look at point 1 and point 2, and then you have a certain risk appetite. I think that Jake's and President Biden's in particular, like there was a whole consensus around the team, with maybe an exception of Secretary Blinken, who was a little bit more forward-coming, was very, very little. So making that incremental led to what people argue is a waste of time and so on. But from the US national security perspective, I think that was a very well-calibrated approach. That
oil and prop carefully, slowly.
Yes, that's underappreciated. So, but if that partnership that has been established through Ukrainian ingenuity and bravery, so they deserve to be supported, but also with a lot of support from the West, will be broken, which is Putin's aim, right? Ukraine has very little chances to withstand a new aggression, and that will be an invitation. Maybe an aggression will not be needed.
So when you're talking about security guarantees, you're effectively talking about the maybe formalized continuation of the current arrangement, but without tripwire force.
So if you're President Zelensky, and I think that's where the discussion we had before the start of this panel, whether we have it on the record or off the record, is that there is a split screen between what has been told to Ukraine and to Western publics in public and what's been discussed in the private. And unfortunately, that gap, I don't think, has helped anybody to have an honest conversation. And I think that people should realize that in year 4 of this ugly war, and definitely be informed by that in year 5, since we are likely to enter it. And it was very, very clear that Ukraine is not becoming a member of NATO with full-fledged guarantees anytime soon. Not before the war, not during. That was very clear from the very beginning.
It was clear from the very beginning. What drives me crazy is that last year in the Washington NATO summit, it was still in the document, Ukraine's future is in NATO. If you don't have any intention to allow Ukraine into NATO, why the hell would you put that in the document?
Oh, but that's because it will humiliate us in the West, and then we will be taking orders from Vladimir Putin. We cannot allow to do that.
Yeah.
So the ugly compromise of the Bucharest summit, a vague promise that Ukraine and Georgia's future lie in NATO, which nobody was willing to implement.
Yeah.
Definitely with the arrival of Obama, nobody was ready to walk that back because, like, oh, okay, but Putin is not stupid to not understand that this is a symbolic fig leaf. And yes, he invaded Georgia, but that was because of Saakashvili's own mistakes and so on. He will not do anything dramatic. And people have underappreciated COVID and Putin being in charge for 20 plus years, reading horrible history books, not Professor Radchenko's history books.
Well, actually, I think if he read my book, he would appreciate it because I do talk about this question of this recognition of greatness, right, which is very, very important for Russian policymakers, not just Russian policymakers. But in this context, you look at NATO enlargement, and you might say, and this is, by the way, this allows you to square the circle of whether the Russians are afraid of NATO enlargement for security reasons or what. I mean, my view on this is that even if you say, and I don't want to go into that, whether they actually are afraid of NATO enlargement for security reasons, but you might argue that they could see NATO enlargement as, and that's by the way segues my next question, but they might see it as humiliating Russia. In other words, it's something that if you see NATO grow in size, etc., at the expense of your former vassals, client states, etc., you decide that you are being humiliated by that. So it's ultimately not about security as much as about Russia's status. That would be the argument.
I 100% agree, by the way.
Which is very different from where most of this arguments about NATO go, because you have in the States in particular, you have this crowd that says, well, it's all the Mearsheimer argument. It's all about, security, and the Russians are afraid about, NATO enlargement. And you have others who say, no, they're not. It's all about imperialism. This question of status, I think, is super important, which brings me to my question. And you mentioned that already, the so-called security architecture of Europe, which is a fascinating subject. We had in December 2021, we had the documents that were put forward, which still have not, we don't have a clear understanding even today whether these documents were just practical bullshit that was put there in order to ruin any kind of negotiations before Russia's invasion, which was already decided on, or whether the Russians actually intend to or really wanted that thing, and that's a part of their agenda. And now you sometimes hear still Putin or Lavrov talk about this stuff. Not that Lavrov is particularly important, but recently he raised this issue of Finland and Sweden being rolled back from NATO, stuff like that. You hear that, you think, are these people for real?
Two fingers on security and prestige. I agree with your argument by and large on prestige. I think that there have been elements of security, but that was not tied to NATO expansion necessarily, but some discussions about the missile defense sites.
Yeah.
And then Americans were blatantly lying to their Russian counterparts that, oh, we built this in Poland and Romania, and it has to do with Iran.
Yep.
It has nothing to do with you, Russia. And yes, the radar will be able to look at Kola Peninsula where bulk of your nukes is there. But don't worry about that. It's all about Iran. And then when the Russians offered them a couple of options, like, yeah, if it's about Iran, why don't we do that in Azerbaijan? It's closer to Iran. Have a look at the map. Or maybe in Armavir in Russia. The Americans said, oh no, the technicalities don't work for us. And just a very...
So this is the Bush administration.
Yeah, continued with Obama administration.
I thought Obama gave up on this stuff.
Gave up on part of this stuff, but continued with some elements. One element, did these missiles and sites being used when Iran launched its missile attacks on Israel? Mm-hmm. Have they been used in that counterattack?
Well, I thought they did not. I thought they canceled that stuff.
No, it's there.
No, the interceptors and
the interceptors are not there, but the radar is there.
On the radar, okay.
And there is a different, more flexible architecture with Aegis and so on that actually, over the long term, can evolve in a way that it can threaten the Russian nuclear deterrent. Like that's a long-term perspective.
So the American counter argument to that would be, if you want to overwhelm our missile defense with your whatever thousands of missiles, there's no way we can counter that.
True, but I think that the deliberate lying that, oh, it has nothing to do with you, Russia, it's about Iran.
Yeah.
I think that's where the Russians were like, oh, why are you lying to me? Just tell us a real reason, which is,
well, I think,
I don't know.
Right. W will still be judged by history on this, for this and other reasons.
So I guess that I totally agree with your prestige argument, and I think that Ukraine was mostly about prestige. But then this particular part was also adding like, okay, and they're expanding this bloc politically, but the moment they want to turn it like into a real military installment next to our borders, they can do that, and they cannot be trusted, and we cannot trust anything what they sign or what they say, and we need to take our destiny into our own hands, right? That's the thing. On the December 21 document, that's one of the major factors that led me to conclusion towards the end of that year that actually what the Americans are telling us in their newspapers is right, and the Russians will invade, because the production of this ultimatum was just so not in line with the way that Putin's diplomacy has worked. And I was a Kremlin reporter and diplomatic reporter for the major Russian newspaper. I know Lavrov and many other people personally. So that's definitely not the way they operate. Producing a document out of nowhere that has absolutely outsized demands that were never part of the conversation, giving Americans a very short deadline, publishing the demands the moment that Karen Dorfman, then Assistant Secretary in charge of Europe and Russia, left Moscow. That's just something very, very weird. And to me, that was definitely diplomatic.
And for the record, I remember we had the dinner in Moscow right before the invasion, where Sasha told me they're going to invade for sure. That's crazy. Why would they do that? But I remember what you told me at that point, which was a great line. You said, because you have a colleague in the Kremlin. Remember those words?
Yeah.
That you have a colleague, meaning historian in the Kremlin.
Yeah. In a way. And he's a far worse historian than Professor Radchenko. But anyway, I think that we have a saying in Russian which is difficult to translate, but it's that appetite comes during the meal.
I think it's a French saying.
Okay, well, French know a lot about these things, but we have the same attitude in Russia. So I think that this was back then in December 21. You remember, like, roll back NATO infrastructure to 94 and all of that stuff. It's still available. So it was put there to be rejected and to give a pretext for the war, right? A broader pretext than just Ukraine. But
it's still being put as to be rejected. Is that what?
But I think that it might have a life of its own.
Yeah.
Because if you read the conclusion of the war, which you will see, or this round of fighting, at some point, Russia will not be defeated, right? Let's put it that way. If you put the victory as Zelensky's initial peace plan, which Russians will withdraw the troops from all of the stolen territory, including Crimea, as a precondition, and they will talk how we will organize a Nuremberg tribunal around Putin, how Russians will pay Ukraine for generations, how we will tear out their nuclear teeth, whatever was right? That will not happen. And again, the split screen, the fact that it was fed to the public and that the Western governments, when asked, like, do you think that's realistic with a nuclear superpower? They said, oh, it's not for us to judge. We support it because it's President Zelensky and it's Ukrainian plan. Like, okay, but that's where a lot of these expectations have been elevated.
Yeah.
And now people are very disappointed. Like, you promised us that we're gonna have a victory parade on the Red Square and Russians will be humiliated on their knees.
Again, but we also have to be careful not to read history backwards, because if you go back to 2022, the Russian withdrawal, the fear of a Russian meltdown, which was averted by the Russians in the fall of 2022. Of course, there were nuclear scare, etc. And then we had Prigozhin's mutiny, which again suggested that something might go in any direction. So at that time there was more hope and more, perhaps,
I agree, but there was no, and I know for a fact that people were thinking in terms of Plan B and Plan C and Plan D scenarios in Washington, D.C., like adults in the room.
Sure.
But they were never visible.
Yeah.
And that's where this.
We were making that visible. We talked about various, possible conclusions to the war.
Yeah.
But we don't count, right? We're not governments. So.
We're not government. So anyway, that victory is unachievable. Whatever will be victory, hopefully it's Ukraine that's sovereign, that's lost de facto control over 20% of its territory, but it has all of the ingredients to be a viable, independent state.
Yeah.
And then there are comparisons about Finland, which Alex Stubb, president of Finland, all the time drives, that we had independence, but we have lost territory and we have lost sovereignty because we all the time wanted to be part of Western family institutionally, and we never could in order to not make our giant neighbor angry.
Finland was economically 100% dependent on Russia, right? Or the
That's
Soviet
right.
Union.
That's right. So, but again, look at Finland, right?
Yeah.
It's a good model. And he all the time says that it's not for us to judge and to tell you Ukrainians after everything what you suffer what to do. But from our experience, that's not the most horrible moment, because Russia's history is also not linear. There are all the time openings with Gorbachev or Alexander the second, so there are windows of opportunity where you can jump out of the imperial bearish hug.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, if Vladimir Putin has a defeated, imploding Ukraine, no credible security guarantees, he believes that was achieved in a fight, not with Ukraine, but with all of NATO.
Yeah.
NATO unleashed sanctions from hell, like everything, Western weapons, Western intelligence, and Russia still stands tall and is able to dictate the terms. And by the way, like his demands for withdrawal of parts of Donbass are done precisely for that. Like this will answer the question, кто кого, like who has actually won, because like you can get stuff from the negotiations table that you cannot still get on the battlefield, right? There is no question who won this war. And with that, the question is where his appetite will go. And I can picture you a scenario where at some point he believes, okay, there is this messy domestic fight in the US, for example, following the presidential election. It's nobody in charge. There is a Rassemblement National government in France. AfD is by far the most popular party. Merz coalition is living by the day, constant fight between the Social Democrats and the Christian Democrats. Reform UK is in charge in UK. And then what you do, you use 6 months to manufacture a security crisis close to Suwalki Gap. You remember the map, on the Lithuanian part. You don't go to Poland. And you now have the strongest, the largest, the kind of best trained battlefield army with bloodthirsty guys who know how to kill and who know how to kill with drones and so on. While Europe it's in third year of slow rearmament that's much more about numbers than about capabilities. And you just do that. And how many people will really die for Lithuania? And you just establish control there and say, oh, by the way, we've been promised a discussion about the European inclusive security architecture. We've been never given that, so we actually want that. And we are not going into Poland. We are not touching anybody else. The German brigade can still sleep in its dorms next to Vilnius, and that's what we want. And nobody will move a finger.
You're talking about the three Baltic states.
Yeah. So just do that, cut the Baltics out, and don't do a large war. Just establish military control over there.
And put NATO for sure.
Exactly. So if that idea, which seems to be crazy, comes to his mind, how many people in the Kremlin will say, Mr. Putin, you are nuts. It's definitely not happening. And by the way, you are arrested because that's dangerous. What if NATO will actually respond? There will be nobody, right?
In other words, if he comes out of this war in a victorious mood, he will be like, he could be like Hitler in after the fall of France, where even the generals say, well, we doubted his genius, but look at this, he's delivered, so therefore he must be right.
And that's unfortunately a not entirely unplausible.
Not a trivial possibility, right? I mean, the only thing that I could object to that is you would thereby re-energize Europe because they would seriously wait. I mean, it's one thing to lose Ukraine. It's another thing to lose a part of the European Union. I mean, that's a major thing, right? So you could potentially bring Europe together in ways that are even more profound than we saw in the immediate aftermath of the Russian invasion. Another argument against this is why would you really do that? Because the Baltics, they don't really matter compared to, let's say, Ukraine, which you feel is part of the Russian identity. And thirdly, you might say, well, there are better targets like Moldova, for example. It's not covered by any kind of security guarantee. So the only reason that to invade the Baltic states at this point appears to be you want to break up NATO because they don't do anything, they're dead. That's it, right? And what else? What else? I mean, strategic reasons you said to reestablish connection to Kaliningrad, or
that's really the only reason is to show that Article 5 is a dead letter, that nobody will fight for like every inch of NATO territory, because like inches of NATO territory are not equal, and inch of Manhattan is different than inch around Suwalki on the Lithuanian side, and then Poland and Lithuania are also different things. If you can prove that by one fact, you don't need to go to a big war. And I think that the rational analysis that you just described was absolutely true in 2021. And that's why a lot of people we know, and a lot of smart people, including Professor Radchenko, believe that all of this talk about war is absolutely crazy and will not materialize. Because, like even if Russia is successful in taking over Ukraine, let's imagine that Russia succeeds in regime change, there will be guerrilla war fighting. Like we know that the Ukrainians are brilliant in this, and like it will be Chechnya multiplied by 10 or 100. NATO will be reinvigorated. Maybe like unthinkable things can happen, like Finland and Sweden would abandon their neutrality and ask to join NATO. More US involvement in European affairs, sanctions, more dependence on China. Like, why is that good for Russia? So if that is seen by everybody, that's clearly seen by Putin. And the price for what? For control over Ukraine, which is kind of atomic pain in the missing limb, like that's lost. Forget about it. But again, this guy took this decision. So if he goes into history as somebody who reestablished Russia to nadir of its importance in European affairs, which is post-Napoleonic Wars with Nicholas I, right, as the policeman of Europe. And you would play a role where you're entitled to a big sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. And then the Americans are out. You read the national security strategy, and they want to, be focused on their hemisphere. That's okay. If you take out the Capitan, the gap between the Capitan and the next most capable European state is such that there is no agreement on who will be European leader. That's very clear.
And that, I think, is he understands that, right? So this question of Europe, the European question, gets it.
And then everybody will try to cut their bilateral deals with the Russians, where he will be the arbiter and will be replacing the United States. If that's the idea, it's a very worthy goal if you want to put your name out there as Catherine the Great or Peter the Great.
Well, a very depressing discussion. Let's